stop! Please, you cannot eat this cake!
Thank you. You saved us.
Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click, but for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance, the employee warns the millionaire. Someone put something in your cake. 2 hours later. The poison was already in the cake when Lucia burst into the ballroom. There was no time to think of the consequences. No time to remember she was just an employee. That her blue uniform with white lace betrayed her among the designer suits and evening gowns filling the Bella Vista restaurant on this Friday night. No time for anything, except to get there before he put his fork in. "Don Rodrigo," she shouted from the entrance, her voice shattering the string quartet's music like a stone breaking a mirror. 200 heads turned towards her. Rodrigo Villanueva, 52, owner of the Villanueva Constructions Group and one of the richest men in Jalisco, looked up from his glass of Chateau Petru with an expression Lucia knew all too well. That of a man about to humiliate someone in front of witnesses. "Lucia," he said, pronouncing her name as if it were both a question and a sentence. She crossed the room without stopping. Waiters parted. A woman with a pearl necklace let out a small gasp of indignation as she watched the uniformed girl weave between tables adorned with white linen tablecloths and purple orchid centerpieces. No one stopped her, perhaps because no one imagined a domestic employee might have a real reason to disrupt the year's most important anniversary dinner. Rodrigo Villanueva's 50th birthday celebration. "Sir," Lucia said, when she reached the main table, breathless, her dark hair escaping the tight bun she always wore. "Please, don't eat the cake. Don't eat it." Rodrigo stared at her. To his right sat Isabella, his sister-in-law, in a red dress that cost more than Lucia earned in 6 months. To his left, Herman Alcantara, his partner of 20 years, smiled that crocodile smile Lucia had never quite deciphered. Across from him, Mateo, Rodrigo's teenage son, watched her, his eyes wide, half surprised, half frightened. "What are you doing here?" Rodrigo asked, lowering his voice to a cold, controlled tone. "This is a private event." "I know, sir, I know, and I'm terribly sorry, but I had to come because I saw something." Lucia swallowed. She glanced at the cake. It was a masterpiece of pastry. 5 tiers of dark chocolate with gold decorations, sugar flowers, and a small figure of a businessman on top. Beautiful. Lethal. "Sir, they put something in your cake. I saw it. Someone put something in it in the kitchen before they brought it out." The ensuing silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then came the laughter. First Herman, with a soft, condescending chuckle. Then some guests from nearby tables who had overheard. Isabella brought a perfectly manicured hand to her lips, feigning discretion. But her eyes were also laughing, cold and satisfied. "Lucia," Rodrigo said, and now his voice had that velvet texture he used when he wanted to make someone feel small. "Do you know how much this dinner cost?" "No, sir." 480,000 pesos. He paused, letting the number hang in the air. Every guest in this room was personally selected. The menu was designed by Chef Bautista, who has a Michelin star. "I ordered this cake 3 weeks ago from the best bakery in Guadalajara." He leaned back in his chair with the calm of a man who knows the world revolves around him. "And you, my domestic employee, come here to tell me they put something in the cake?" "Yes, sir." "Did you see who did it?" Lucia hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. I saw something suspicious. White powder in the kitchen before they brought it out." Rodrigo let out a brief, dry laugh. "White powder?" He repeated the words as if they were a joke. "Do you know how many white powders are used in pastry, Lucia? Powdered sugar, baking soda, cornstarch." He stood up just enough to reach for the dessert fork. "I'm sure you have good intentions. But Don Rodrigo, please," she insisted, her voice cracking slightly. Not from fear, but from desperate urgency. "Just wait. Just wait a moment and call someone to check the cake. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if I'm right, if you're right," Rodrigo interrupted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I promise I'll listen to you, but if..." He extended the fork towards the cake. "Tomorrow we'll discuss your employment situation." It was Mateo who spoke. Then, the 15-year-old boy, with the round face of his dead mother and the dark eyes of his father, looked at Lucia, then at the cake, then at his father. "Dad," he said quietly, "maybe you should listen to her." Rodrigo turned his head towards his son with an expression that mixed wounded pride with something softer, more human. "Mateo." It was at that moment that Herman Alcantara's phone vibrated on the table. The partner looked at it. His crocodile smile vanished in less than a second. His tanned, clean-shaven face turned the color of wax. He stood up so quickly he knocked over his wineglass, and the Chateau Petru spilled onto the white tablecloth like a wound. "I have to," he said, not finishing the sentence. "Excuse me," and he left the room, almost running. Rodrigo followed him with his eyes. Then he looked at Lucia, then at the cake. The fork remained suspended in the air. No one laughed again. The string quartet continued playing for another 45 seconds, before the violinist noticed something had changed in the ballroom's atmosphere, and slowly faded out his bow, like a candle burning down. Guests at the closest tables exchanged glances. Isabella had stopped smiling. Her fingers, adorned with diamond rings, tapped silently on the tablecloth. "What's going on, Rodrigo?" she asked, her voice attempting casualness but failing. "I don't know yet," he replied, his gaze fixed on Lucia. And in that look, for the first time in 3 years of working at the Villanueva mansion, Lucia saw something she hadn't seen before. Doubt. Real, genuine doubt. The first crack in a man who perhaps, just perhaps, was beginning to consider the possibility that his domestic employee was right. "Where did you see it?" Rodrigo finally asked, his voice lower, more private. "In the service kitchen, sir. About 40 minutes ago, when they brought the cake through the back door, a person approached with a small syringe. They injected it through the base, where the gold decoration makes an edge. It's almost invisible." "A syringe?" "Yes, sir." Rodrigo looked at the gold trim of the cake. Lucia saw the exact moment his eyes found what they were looking for. A tiny, almost imperceptible mark the width of a needle, right where the gold frosting met the chocolate of the first tier. His jaw tightened. "Mateo," he said in a calm voice, but with a firmness that admitted no argument. "I want you to get up now, without making a fuss, and go to the car with Beto, the security driver." Mateo understood. "Dad, now, son." The boy stood up, walked slowly with the dignity inherited from his father, but Lucia saw his hands were trembling. Rodrigo then did something no one expected. He pulled out his phone and called someone. Not the police, not a doctor. He called Fernanda Solis, the corporate lawyer for the Villanueva group, whom Lucia had seen him meeting with in the mansion's library dozens of times. "Fernanda," he said when they answered, "I need you to come to the Bella Vista right now. Bring someone you trust who knows about toxicology, and don't tell anyone else." Pause. "Yes, it's urgent." He hung up. He looked at Isabella. "Sister-in-law," he said with a kindness that was almost worse than coldness. "I think dinner is over for tonight." Isabella's face didn't change. She was a 48-year-old woman who had survived 20 years of marriage to Rodrigo's younger brother, 4 years of strategic widowhood, and a lifetime of learning not to show what she felt. But her eyes, those amber eyes that always seemed to be calculating something, flickered towards Lucia with a speed and intensity that made her skin crawl. It wasn't a look of surprise. It was a look of recognition from someone who had just understood that the plan had failed. Outside the restaurant, Guadalajara's sky shimmered with city lights and the distant murmur of music from a party in another building. Lucia stood by the table, unsure what to do with her hands, her body, or her heart, which pounded so loudly she could almost hear it. Rodrigo Villanueva placed a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time in 3 years he had touched her. Not with familiarity, not with romantic warmth, but with the solid, grave gesture of a man acknowledging that someone had just saved his life. "Thank you," he said. "That's all." And in that moment, Lucia knew that nothing in the Villanueva mansion would ever be the same. What she didn't know yet was that the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 years before that night, Lucia Mendoza had arrived at the Villanueva mansion with a small suitcase, a letter of recommendation folded 4 times in her pocket, and a heart still broken into pieces no one else could see. She was 22. She came from Tlacolula, a small town on the border between Jalisco and Michoacán, where houses were made of adobe and dreams dried in the sun before they could mature. She hadn't come to Guadalajara to conquer anything. She had come to survive, which is a completely different and much more honest thing. The letter of recommendation had been written by Mrs. Consuelo Barrera, the owner of the boarding house where Lucia had worked for 18 months after leaving her village. It was a brief, sincere letter that stated, among other things, that Lucia was discreet, responsible, and had an extraordinary memory for details. That last phrase, written almost as an unimportant addendum, would turn out to be the most relevant of all. The Villanueva mansion was a world apart. 400 square meters of garden, 7 bedrooms, a cinema room, a library, a professional kitchen, and a pool with a blue mosaic bottom that reflected the Jalisco sky like a second, horizontal sky. Rodrigo Villanueva lived there with his son Mateo, then 12 years old, and a silent army of employees, 2 cooks, 3 cleaning staff, a gardener, a chauffeur, and Beto, the bodyguard who seemed to have merged with the landscape from being so constantly present. Lucia was hired as a chambermaid and kitchen assistant. The first few months, she learned the unwritten rules of the house. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make noise in the library wing after 9 p.m. Don't mention Mrs. Valeria in front of the child, Mateo's mother, who had died in a car accident 3 years before Lucia's arrival. And above all, never enter Don Rodrigo's study without knocking twice, even if the door was open. They were sensible rules for a house of sensitive people. What no one explained to Lucia was the most important rule of all. Distrust Isabella Fuentes de Villanueva. Isabella had entered the family's life as a sister-in-law, wife of Ernesto, Rodrigo's younger brother. A kind and nervous man who died of a heart attack at 44, leaving Isabella with a modest fortune and enormous ambition. After Ernesto's death, Isabella settled in Guadalajara, 15 minutes from the mansion, and became a constant, hard-to-ignore presence. She appeared at Mateo's birthdays, business dinners, Sunday afternoons, always impeccably dressed, always with something clever to say, always with that smile Lucia had learned to recognize as a mask she never removed. It took Lucia 6 months to understand that Isabella wanted something from Don Rodrigo that he wasn't willing to give. It wasn't love, though she pretended it was. It was money. It was status. It was the full Villanueva name, not just a borrowed one. And Rodrigo, who was sharp in business but strangely blind to the people closest to him, didn't seem to mind or even notice. It was a Tuesday in October, 8 months before the restaurant night, when Lucia saw what she shouldn't have. It was 6:40 a.m. Lucia always arrived before any other employee to prepare Mateo's breakfast. The boy had classes at 7:01 and liked to eat at his own pace, a habit Lucia had learned to respect and protect without being asked. She entered the kitchen through the side door and stopped. Isabella was there. It wasn't unusual for Isabella to be at the mansion at that hour. She'd had a key for 2 years, a privilege Rodrigo had given her, in case Mateo needed anything during his work absences. What was unusual was what she was doing. Isabella stood before the kitchen island, her back to the door, bent over something. Her movements were quick, focused, entirely unlike the elegant slowness with which she usually moved. She held a small, unlabeled dark glass vial in one hand, and with the other, she was steadying something over the coffee cup, already prepared on the island, precisely where Don Rodrigo took his coffee each morning, before going to the gym. Lucia held her breath. Isabella noticed something in the cup, a fine powder, almost invisible against the dark liquid. She stirred it with a small spoon she'd taken from her purse, not from the kitchen drawers, and put it back in the same bag, with a movement so calculated that Lucia understood in that instant it wasn't the first time. It was then that her sense of smell struck a chord of memory. It wasn't a strong odor. It was soft, almost floral, with something bitter underneath, like wildflowers mixed with almonds. A scent Lucia had known once before, under circumstances that had cost her everything. Her mother. Guadalupe Mendoza had died when Lucia was 17. It wasn't a quick or merciful death. It was a slow, 3-week decline that the doctors at the regional hospital in Tlacalula had classified as heart failure of indeterminate cause, because in small, under-resourced hospitals, indeterminate cause was sometimes the only available answer. But Lucia remembered the smell. She remembered it because she had slept in the hospital corridor for 3 weeks, going in whenever she was allowed, holding her mother's hand, and the scent was always there in Guadalupe's breath, in her sweat, in the air of the room. That floral scent with a bitter undertone that the doctors couldn't explain and that Lucia never forgot. Years later, in Guadalajara, on a sleepless night spent scrolling through her phone about medicinal plants and natural poisons, One of those aimless searches the mind makes when it can't sleep. Lucia found the description of digitalis, the foxglove plant, used in controlled doses as a heart medication, and in high doses, a deadly poison that caused arrhythmias, heart failure, and a characteristic scent, almost floral, with a bitter undertone reminiscent of almonds. Lucia read that description 3 times. Then she closed her phone and didn't sleep all night. She never confirmed it. There was no way to confirm it. Not with the resources she had. But from that night on, something changed in the way she looked at the world. Something sharpened. An invisible antenna that hadn't existed before now picked up frequencies others couldn't hear. And that October morning, in the Villanueva mansion's kitchen, that antenna screamed. Isabella left the kitchen without noticing Lucia, or so she thought. Lucia waited until she heard the sound of the main door. Then she approached the kitchen island. The coffee cup was there, perfectly prepared, steaming, innocent, in plain sight. Lucia picked it up carefully, smelled it. There it was, soft, almost imperceptible, floral with a bitter undertone. She poured the coffee down the sink, washed the cup twice, made fresh coffee, and when Rodrigo Villanueva came down at 7:10, he gave his usual curt, "Good morning," and drank his coffee by the window overlooking the garden. Lucia watched him from the corner of the kitchen with a question she didn't know how to ask herself. What do you do when you discover something like this? Who do you tell? Who's going to believe you? The 22-year-old housekeeper from a town no one has ever heard of, accusing the millionaire's sister-in-law. She remained silent, but she did throw away the coffee. Every day for 8 months, when she found the prepared cup with that scent, she threw it away, made a new one, and said nothing. Until that night at the Bella Vista restaurant, when she saw the syringe. Returning to the present, in the backseat of Don Rodrigo's car taking him back to the mansion, while Fernanda Solis and the hastily hired toxicologist took the cake in a refrigerated box for analysis, Lucia stared out the window, not truly seeing the city lights. Rodrigo traveled in silence beside her. Beto was driving. The car's climate control hummed softly. "How long have you been working at my house?" Rodrigo asked suddenly. 3 years, sir. It was 3 years in March. And in all that time, you never had a problem. You never complained about anything. No, sir. Why? Lucia considered the answer before giving it. Because in big houses, sir, people who complain about small things lose their jobs, and I need the job. Rodrigo nodded very slowly. He looked out his own window. Do you have family? No, sir, just me. Another silence. Lucia, Rodrigo finally said, in a voice Lucia hadn't heard before. Lower, more tired, more human. This was the first time you noticed something, and there it was. The question she had anticipated and dreaded for months. The question that opened the door to everything she had kept silent about. If she said yes, she would be lying. If she said no, she would have to explain the 8 months of silence, the coffee poured down the sink, the mornings of October and November and December and January and February and March and all the months that followed, during which she had protected this man without him knowing and without asking for anything in return. She looked at her hands in her lap. She decided to tell the truth. No, sir, she replied softly. It wasn't the first time. The ensuing silence was the longest of the journey. When Rodrigo spoke again, his voice was so quiet Lucia barely heard it over the engine noise. Tell me everything. And she did. The results arrived at 2:17 a.m. Fernanda Solis entered the mansion's library with a tablet in her hand, and an expression Lucia would never forget, that of a woman who had spent 20 years managing corporate crises and who, for the first time in her career, didn't quite know how to deliver the news. Rodrigo sat behind the mahogany desk. Lucia occupied the armchair closest to the door, the one people always sat in when waiting for permission to leave. Beto stood guard from the hallway, arms crossed, jaw tense. Digitalis, Fernanda said, without preamble. In the cake and in the sample. From the coffee cup that Lucia recovered this morning. She placed the tablet on the desk. On the screen was a preliminary report with numbers and graphs that Lucia couldn't read, but that clearly indicated something serious. The concentration in the cake was enough to cause severe ventricular arrhythmia in a healthy adult, let alone someone with your history of high blood pressure, Rodrigo. She didn't finish the sentence. It wasn't necessary. Rodrigo looked at the report for what seemed a very long time. Then he looked up at Lucia. 8 months, he said. Yes, sir. You were protecting me for 8 months without telling me anything. It wasn't a question but a statement spoken aloud, as if he needed to hear it to fully believe it. "I had no proof, sir, only the smell," and Lucia breathed out. "And no one would have believed me." Rodrigo didn't respond to that, but he didn't deny it either, and that silence was its own answer. Fernanda picked up the tablet and slid her finger to reveal a second screen. "Is there anything else?" she asked. The toxicologist, he found traces of another substance, a small amount, but present. It's called scopolamine. In low doses, it causes confusion, short-term memory loss, disorientation. She paused. It doesn't kill, but it makes the person much more manageable, susceptible to making decisions they wouldn't normally make. The silence in the library took on a different texture. "Decisions like changing a will," Rodrigo said, his voice so quiet it was almost more threatening than if he had shouted. Fernanda nodded. "That's what I think, yes." Lucia understood at that moment the full scope of what she was looking at. It wasn't just an attempted murder. It was a plan built in layers like a poisoned onion. First, the scopolamine to make Rodrigo pliable and malleable. Then, the accumulated pressure from Isabella, her constant visits, her strategic conversations to convince him to alter his will in her favor. And finally, once the money was secured on paper, the digitalis to close the matter permanently. Months of work, perhaps more than a year of planning, and the birthday cake would have been the final touch. "When was the last time you reviewed your will?" Fernanda asked. Rodrigo opened a desk drawer and pulled out a thin folder. He opened it. He read in silence for 3 minutes. That felt like 30 to Lucia. "There's a clause," he finally said, "that I don't remember approving. It states that in the event of death without direct adult heirs, 50% of the estate passes to a trust administered by—" He stopped. His voice changed texture. "Administered by Isabella Fuentes de Villanueva." "Mateo is a minor?" Fernanda asked. "He's 15. Then, that clause would activate?" "Yes." No one spoke for a moment. "When was this document signed?" Fernanda asked. Rodrigo looked for the date at the end of the last page. 4 months ago, he replied. And then, in a voice that held a mix of disbelief and horror, "I don't remember signing this." Fernanda and Lucia exchanged a brief glance. The scopolamine. The meeting lasted until almost 4 a.m. Fernanda made calls. Beto reinforced the mansion's security. Rodrigo summoned his personal lawyer to review all documents signed in the last 12 months. Lucia remained seated in the same armchair the entire time, because no one told her she could leave, and she didn't want to interrupt by asking. Hours passed. She brought coffee 3 times. No one thanked her, but no one asked her to leave either. And in that house, that was a strange form of belonging. It was around 3 a.m. when Fernanda sat beside her with a cup of tea that Lucia hadn't been asked for, and had prepared anyway. "How did you know about the smell?" Fernanda asked, with a curiosity that held no condescension. Lucia told her about her mother. She did it briefly, without drama, in the neutral tone she used for things that hurt too much to tell with emotion. Fernanda listened in silence. "You never tried to investigate what happened to your mother?" "I didn't have money for a lawyer. I didn't have connections. I had nothing." Lucia looked at her cup. "I had to close that door, or I wouldn't have been able to keep walking." Fernanda nodded slowly. "And what if you could open it now?" Lucia looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if Rodrigo decides to proceed with this, and he will, I assure you, there will be an investigation, a serious investigation, with resources. And if your mother died from the same substance, from the same source, I don't know if it was Isabella," Lucia said quickly. "I don't know if they have any connection. My mother never had anything to do with moneyed people." "Perhaps not, but sometimes coincidences are the first page of truth." Fernanda sipped her tea. "Don't close that door just yet, Lucia. Isabella was identified as the prime suspect before dawn. It wasn't difficult because the evidence was a path with clear footprints once someone took the time to follow it. The digitalis vial was traced to a specialty pharmacy in Tlaquepaque, where Isabella had an account under a shell corporation. The kitchen cameras at the Bella Vista restaurant showed a person in a chef's hat injecting the cake, but the angle was bad and the face couldn't be seen. What could be seen were the navy blue latex gloves, the specific kind used by high-end caterers. And at the bottom of Isabella's purse, which Beto had discreetly photographed in the restaurant, seizing a moment of confusion, was a pair of navy blue gloves rolled up in a plastic bag. It wasn't enough proof for a trial, but it was enough to know, "I need more," Rodrigo said when Fernanda presented him with everything. "I don't just want to stop her. I want her to never be able to do this again. Then we need the accomplice, Fernanda said. No one does something like this alone. Someone disabled the restaurant cameras. Someone coordinated the cake delivery. Someone had access to your schedule to know exactly when and where you were going to be. The three of them looked at the list of people who had access to Rodrigo Villanueva's personal schedule. It was a very short list. Rodrigo read it from top to bottom, then read it again, and then his face changed in a way Lucia had never seen. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it was something harder to describe, akin to the sensation of stepping where you thought there was solid ground and finding air. Elena said in a low voice. His personal secretary, 12 years by his side. Yes, Fernanda said, her voice apologetic without saying it. Elena. The silence that followed was the heaviest of that long night. Lucia asked permission to leave shortly before 4. Rodrigo granted it with a nod, without looking up from the papers. She went up to the small room she occupied in the service wing. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands for a long time. Outside, the garden began to show the first gray colors of dawn. A bird started to sing in the jacaranda tree growing by the back fence. Lucia thought of her mother. She thought of the floral scent with a bitter undertone during the 3 weeks in the hospital, of the doctors who said undetermined cause, and shrugged at the door she had closed to keep walking, and that Fernanda was asking her to open. She thought about whether she was brave enough to do it, and she thought about something else. Something she had been pushing from the edges of her mind all night and could no longer ignore. Isabella's look in the restaurant when everything began to fall apart. That look of recognition from someone who understands the plan failed, but not from someone who understands the game was over. Isabella was the type of woman who, when a plan fails, doesn't give up. She builds another plan, faster, more desperate, more dangerous. And Lucia, who had gone from being an invisible employee to being the only direct witness to everything, had just become the biggest obstacle between Isabella and what she wanted. That meant something very specific. That meant she was in danger now too. She lay down dressed on the bed, without closing her eyes, looking at the ceiling, as the dawn slowly filled the small window of her room. Outside, the bird kept singing in the jacaranda. Inside, Lucia Mendoza began to understand that her life, the one before, the one of the silent employee who poured coffee and said nothing, had ended that night. What would come now was something completely different, and she still didn't know if she was ready. Elena Paredes had been Rodrigo Villanueva's shadow for 12 years, not in the poetic sense of the phrase, but in the literal and operational sense. She was the person who knew where he was at every hour, what he ate, who he met with, what decisions he was considering, and which ones he had already made. She was the one who coordinated his calendar, screened his calls, drafted his emails when he didn't have time, and kept the secrets of his business with the same discretion a confessor keeps sins. She was in many ways the person who knew Rodrigo Villanueva the most in the world, and she was also, according to the call logs that Fernanda Solis presented that very morning, the person who had had 47 communications with Isabella Fuentes' personal number in the last 3 months. Text messages. Calls, most of them under 2 minutes. The last one, sent at 10:50 p.m. on Friday, 40 minutes after the incident at the restaurant, said only 4 words. The employee saw it. Rodrigo read the message on Fernanda's phone screen, his expression unchanged. Only his eyes, which were dark and generally calm, took on a different density, like water that becomes deeper without the surface changing. "How did you get this?" he asked. "Better if you don't know yet," Fernanda said. "It's legal enough." Rodrigo handed the phone back. "Where is Elena now?" "In her apartment. According to her car's GPS, she hasn't left since last night. Does she know we're watching her? She shouldn't, but..." Fernanda chose her words carefully. "Elena is smart, very smart. If something in the air indicates to her that the plan failed definitively, she might move." "Move where?" "Depends on how scared she is and how much she owes Isabella." Rodrigo got up from his desk and walked to the window overlooking the garden. The morning sun was already full, and the jacaranda in the background cast a long shadow over the grass. Lucia, who had come down at 8 with coffee and bread for those present, and no one had told her to leave, was sitting again in her usual armchair with a mug in her hands, listening without participating. "I need to talk to Elena," Rodrigo said finally. "That could complicate the investigation," Fernanda warned. "I don't care. 12 years, Fernanda. 12 years working with me. I need to look her in the face and hear what she has to say." Fernanda knew him well enough to know that when he used that tone, no argument would prevail. Fine, but let it be here, in the mansion, on controlled territory, and with Beto in the room. Elena Paredes arrived at 11 in the morning. She was 41 years old, with brown hair, always pulled back in a very professional bun, much like Lucia's, but with a $20,000 difference in the suit that accompanied it. She was a woman of discreet presence and visible efficiency. The type of person who enters a room and in 30 seconds already knows where everything is and how it works. When she entered the library and saw Rodrigo behind the desk, Fernanda to his right, Beto by the door, and Lucia in the corner armchair, her face revealed nothing. It was a perfect mask, professional to the last second. You told me it was urgent. What happened last night? I heard there was a problem at the restaurant. Sit down, Elena, Rodrigo said. She sat, clasped her hands in her lap. She waited. Do you know anyone who knows about toxicology? Rodrigo asked. A blink. Barely one. Toxicology. No, not that I recall. Why? Because last night someone poisoned my birthday cake. He said it without drama, as if reporting a minor logistical problem. Digitalis. Enough to kill me. Elena opened her eyes a little more than necessary. It was a calculated reaction intended to appear spontaneous, and Lucia, who had spent 3 years learning to read the gestures of people who lived by gesticulating for others, saw it immediately. It wasn't surprise, it was the acting of surprise. Oh my God, Elena said. Are you okay? Who? How much did Isabella pay you? The silence fell like an axe on a board. Elena didn't answer immediately, and in that space between the question and the answer that never came, everything was confirmed in a way that no call log could have surpassed. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally. 47 messages in 3 months, Elena. The last one last night at 10:50. Rodrigo slid the printed sheet with the communication log towards her. That's what you wrote, right? To let her know the plan had failed. Elena looked at the sheet, looked at it for a long time. Then she did something no one expected. She let out a brief, bitter laugh, completely stripped of her professional mask. 12 years, she said, and now her voice was different, rougher, more real. 12 years, Rodrigo, without a full vacation, without a personal life, without anything that didn't revolve around your schedule. Do you know how many times you promised me a share in the group? How many times you said that when Project X or Contract Y was done, we would talk? Elena, Isabella offered me 3% of the trust if the plan worked. She said it with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. 3% of 200 million pesos. 6 million. 6 million for 12 years of my life, Rodrigo. It seemed fair to me. The sentence hung in the air of the library with all its weight. Rodrigo didn't answer. Lucia saw him clench his jaw once, just once, and then relax it with the control of a man who has learned that showing pain in front of the one who caused it is the worst defeat possible. What exactly did you do? Fernanda asked, taking control of the conversation with the efficiency of someone who knows feelings can wait, but evidence cannot. Elena looked at her, considered, and then, with the same dry clarity with which she had confessed the above, she spoke. It had been her who disabled the cameras at the Bella Vista restaurant. She had access to the system because she herself had managed the security contract for the venue when the Villanueva group used it for a corporate event the previous year, and no one had changed the credentials. It had been her who modified the cake order, adding a special instruction to the delivery person to deliver the dessert through the back door and leave it in the service kitchen for 10 minutes before taking it to the main hall. Enough time for Isabella's person to do what she had to do. And it had been her who, for the past 4 months, had prepared Rodrigo's coffee in the mornings, when he arrived before the cooks, adding the doses of scopolamine that Isabella provided her in a small, unlabeled vial. When she finished speaking, the library was so silent that the wind in the garden's jacaranda could be heard. The will, Fernanda said, the clause Rodrigo doesn't remember approving. Yes, it was in February, a Tuesday morning. I had put in double the usual dose. Isabella came to the 10 o'clock meeting with the documents already prepared. Rodrigo signed them. He doesn't remember doing it because by that time he had been taking scopolamine for 3 weeks and his short-term memory was affected. Rodrigo stood up from his chair, walked to the window, placed a hand on the glass, and looked at the garden. No one spoke for a full minute. It was Lucia who, from her corner armchair, said the only thing left to say. He didn't plan it, he didn't think about it, it just came out. Like things that are so obvious that they wait in silence until someone says them. The cell phone, she said. You left it at the restaurant. Elena turned towards her. For the first time that morning, something in her expression showed a real crack. Not guilt, but the recognition of a mistake she hadn't noticed until that moment. What cell phone? The one left on the table when he got up to go to the bathroom, just before Don Rodrigo confronted Don Herman last night. A plain black phone. I saw it on the floor beneath the chair. I picked it up because I thought it belonged to a guest. Lucia took a small, plain black phone out of her apron pocket. It had messages from Isabella. I read them because it had no passcode, and I wanted to know who to return it to. The color completely drained from Elena Paredes's face. Fernanda Solis crossed the room in 3 strides and picked up the phone with the delicacy of someone collecting a piece of evidence that could change everything. She unlocked it, read, and smiled for the first time that long, terrible morning. Rodrigo said, "We have everything we need." Elena was escorted by Bido to a room in the guest wing, where she would wait under guard until the right person arrived to take her formal statement. She hadn't been arrested yet. Fernanda had a more precise plan than simply calling the police and waiting. When the door to the room closed, Rodrigo returned to the library and sat down behind the desk again. He looked older than he had 12 hours before, not in a physical way, but in that other way people age when they discover the world they thought they knew had a false wall with another room behind it. He looked at Lucia for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me about the coffee in February, or January, or any of the months before?" It was the question Lucia had asked herself more than 100 times. "Because if I had," she answered honestly, "you would have asked me how I knew what that smell was, and I would have had to tell you about my mother, and then you would have asked me if I had proof, and I didn't. And then," she paused, "it would have just been the word of a 25-year-old housekeeper against your sister-in-laws. And you already know how those stories end, sir." Rodrigo looked at her, didn't answer, but by the way he averted his gaze, Lucia knew they both knew the answer. At 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, with Elena under guard in the guest wing and Fernanda silently coordinating the next legal steps from the makeshift boardroom that had occupied the mansion's dining room, Rodrigo Villanueva did something no one expected. He asked Lucia to sit with him in the garden, not as an employee, not as a witness, just as a person. Lucia hesitated at the door that opened onto the terrace, her apron still on, her hands unsure where to go, until Rodrigo gestured to the wrought iron chair in front of him, with a movement that wasn't an order, but an invitation. And that difference, small but real, was enough for her to cross the threshold and sit down. The garden smelled of damp earth and jacaranda. A hummingbird worked silently on the roses in the background. The sky over Guadalajara was that particular shade of blue of spring noons that makes one understand why people write songs about this city. "Do you know why I built the Villanueva group?" Rodrigo asked without preamble. "No, sir." It wasn't out of ambition. He said it as if that clarification mattered, as if he needed someone besides himself to know. It was out of fear. "I grew up without money, not in the kind of poverty that hurts, but in that gray poverty that simply tires you, that makes you feel like the world has different rules for you than for others. My father worked 30 years in a shoe factory and died without severance because the owner conveniently went bankrupt 3 months before his retirement." He paused. "I was 19. I swore no one would ever have that power over me again." Lucia listened without interrupting. She was good at that, at the silence that receives, instead of the silence that excludes. "I built the group from scratch, 20 years of work, and at some point along the way, Rodrigo looked at the garden with an expression that was hard to name, somewhere between pride and something akin to regret. I stopped building out of fear and started building out of inertia because I no longer knew how to do anything else, because Valeria had died and Mateo needed stability. And stability for me has always had the same name, work. Mrs. Valeria was Mateo's mother, my wife. She died 5 years ago in an accident on the road to Tepic. He said it with the brevity of someone who has uttered the phrase so many times it has been emptied of its immediate weight, though the weight remained, distributed differently. She was the only person who told me the truth without caring about the consequences. After her, I was surrounded by people who told me what I wanted to hear. Elena, Germán, Isabella, all with their own reasons for keeping me happy and distracted. "And Don Germán?" Lucia asked carefully. "Him too. Germán isn't part of this." Rodrigo said it with the conviction of someone who had reviewed that certainty several times and always found the same thing. The call he received last night at the restaurant was from his son. The boy had a motorcycle accident. That's why he left like that. He paused. I've already verified it. Lucia nodded. She was silent for a moment. Why are you telling me all this, sir? Rodrigo looked at her directly. He had the eyes of a man who had slept 2 hours and thought much more than was healthy in a very short period. Because you've been in my house for 3 years, he said. And I know nothing about you. And last night you saved my life. And this morning it turns out you've been doing it silently for 8 months. And it seems to me, he searched for the word, it seems to me a huge injustice not to know anything about the person who did that. Lucia spoke, not everything, because there are things that aren't said in a first real conversation, but yes, enough. She told him about the town of Telecolula, about the mother who died when she was 17, about the 2 years working at Senora Consuelo's boarding house, about arriving in Guadalajara with a small suitcase and a letter of recommendation folded into quarters. She told him how she had learned to read the spaces in large houses, to become part of the landscape so that people would speak freely around her, not remembering she was there. She told him she liked to read, that at night, when her shift was over, she would borrow books from the library with the head cook's permission and always return them before dawn. What books? Rodrigo asked, and in his voice was a curiosity that wasn't condescending, but genuine. Everything, but mostly history and medicine. She paused. I started reading about medicine after what happened to my mom. I wanted to understand what I couldn't understand then. And did you understand it? Part of it, enough to recognize the smell in the kitchen. Rodrigo nodded slowly. Fernanda told me there might be a connection between what happened to your mother and Isabella. I don't know. It could be a coincidence. My mother had nothing. There was no reason for anyone to want to hurt her. She had land. Lucia opened her mouth to say no, then stopped. Because yes, her mother had land, a small plot on the outskirts of Tlacolula, which she had inherited from her own father, and which was worth very little, or at least that's what she had been told. 3 months after Guadalupe Mendoza's death, that land had been sold by the legal guardian the court had assigned to Lucia, who was a minor at the time, to a company whose name she never knew, because the lawyer who handled the process was a fast-talking city man who signed even faster. She had forgotten it, or perhaps she had filed it away in that same mental folder where she kept things that hurt too much to revisit. She had land, she said slowly. A small piece. They sold it after she died when I was a minor. Do you know to whom? No, I never knew. Rodrigo took out his phone and typed something. Then he put it away. I'll ask Fernanda to investigate. He said it with the naturalness of someone making an operational decision, without making it a gesture of generosity or power, simply as something that is done because it must be done. Does that seem okay to you? Lucia looked at him. She nodded without speaking because, at that moment, words felt too small for what she wanted to express. It was then that Mateo appeared on the terrace. He had spent the night at Uncle Germán's at his father's instruction, but Beto had brought him back that morning, once the mansion was declared safe. His hair was tousled, he wore a t-shirt from a rock band Lucia didn't recognize, and he carried, as always, that particular energy of adolescents who have grown up, surrounded by seriousness, and who, for that very reason, are more intuitive than most adults. He sat down in the third wrought iron chair, without asking permission, with the ease of someone who knows he is welcome in any corner of his own home. Do you know who it was yet? He asked directly. Yes, Rodrigo said. Isabella. A pause. Yes. Mateo nodded very slowly, like someone receiving confirmation of something he already knew, but had hoped was wrong. I always disliked her, he said. I never knew exactly why, but when she arrived, the air in the house changed. He looked at Lucia. You noticed it too, right? Yes, Lucia said honestly. And you listened to me last night, he said to his father. When I told you to listen to her, even though you didn't want to at first. Rodrigo looked at his son with an expression that mixed pride with something more vulnerable. You listened to me, Mateo repeated. That matters. The hummingbird had disappeared from the rose bush. The garden was still and filled with light. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Fernanda presented the complete plan. She had designed it with the methodical precision that characterized her. They wouldn't call the police directly yet, because that would give Isabella time to hire lawyers and construct a narrative before the evidence was fully documented. Instead, they would follow a two-step process. First, submit the evidence to the public ministry, with all the documentation already prepared. The toxicology reports, the call logs, the restaurant camera footage, Elena's phone messages, and Elena's formal statement, whom Fernanda had already convinced to cooperate in exchange for a reduction in charges. Second, a direct confrontation between Rodrigo and Isabella, recorded, in which she would have the opportunity to incriminate herself further, because Fernanda knew Isabella well enough to know that when she felt cornered, she attacked, and when she attacked, she talked too much. "It's a risk," Fernanda admitted. "I know," Rodrigo said. "If Isabella suspects it's a trap, she might not say anything. She won't suspect." Rodrigo said it with the cold certainty of someone who had known a person for years and had learned exactly how they worked. Isabella believes she still controls the situation. She believes that without direct proof and credible witnesses, she can get out of this. He paused. She doesn't know about Elena's cell phone, she doesn't know about the analysis of the cake, and she doesn't know, he looked at Lucia, that my most important witness has been in my house for 3 years, and that I didn't see her. Lucia lowered her gaze. "I saw her," Matteo said from the corner where he had been listening in silence. No one responded to that, but the phrase hung in the dining room air for a moment that everyone felt. That night, as the mansion settled into a tense, watchful calm, Lucia went up to the servants' quarters, sat on the edge of her bed, and opened the book she had been reading for 3 weeks. A story about colonial Mexico that she had taken from the library without anyone asking. She read 2 pages, then closed the book, thought about her mother's land, about the name of the company she never knew, about the fast-talking lawyer, about the door Fernanda had asked her not to close. She thought about Rodrigo in the garden, telling her about his father and the shoe factory, with the voice of a man who rarely tells such things and who, at that moment, couldn't fully explain why he was doing it. He thought of Matteo saying, "I saw her from the first day with the quiet certainty of a 15-year-old who doesn't yet know that seeing people is harder than it looks." And he thought of Isabella, of what she would do when Rodrigo called her, of whether Fernanda's plan would work, of whether those kinds of plans, so neat on paper, could withstand the contact with a woman who had spent her entire life constructing her own plans and surviving others. Outside, the Guadalajara sky had filled with stars. Inside, Lucia Mendoza knew that the next day would be the most difficult of everything she had lived through since arriving in that city, with a small suitcase and a broken heart, and that this time, for the first time, she wouldn't face it alone. Isabella Fuentes de Villanueva received Rodrigo's call at 10 a.m. on Sunday. It was a calm, almost casual call, the kind Rodrigo made occasionally to coordinate family matters. Whether Matteo needed to be taken to the dentist, whether she could attend this or that dinner, only this time he was inviting her to lunch at the mansion that same day, at noon, because he wanted to talk to her about some things that had been left pending after Friday's incident. Isabella accepted. What Rodrigo didn't know, what no one in the mansion knew yet, was that Isabella hung up the phone. She waited exactly 4 minutes, and then dialed another number, a number not listed in any call records, because it was a disposable phone that was changed every 3 weeks. "There's a problem," she said when they answered. "I need you to resolve it before noon." The problem had a name. The problem was called Lucia Mendoza. Don Aurelio Vasquez had been the night watchman of the Villanueva mansion for 19 years. He was 68 years old, with a bad knee from a youthful accident he never fully resolved, and a way of moving through the gardens of the property that was as silent and constant as river water, always present, always in the same approximate spot, so integrated into the landscape that people stopped seeing him. That was, as he himself said when anyone asked, his greatest skill and his greatest sadness at the same time. At 11 a.m. on Sunday, while doing his usual rounds of the outer perimeter fence, a habit he maintained even during his rest hours, because 19 years of surveillance had installed an internal clock he didn't know how to turn off, he noticed something. A gray van with no visible license plates from his angle, parked half a block from the main entrance. It wasn't unusual for there to be vehicles on the street. It was unusual for that vehicle to have been there since 9 a.m., without moving, with 2 people inside who didn't get out or move much. Don Aurelio entered the guardhouse and dialed Beto's extension. "There's a van I don't like," he said without preamble. Beto appeared in the guardhouse 4 minutes later. He looked through the small window. "How long have they been there?" 2 hours, more or less." "I haven't seen them on the block before." Beto pulled out his phone, called someone, spoke in a very low voice. He hung up. "Stay here," he told Don Aurelio. "Don't let anyone in without consulting me first." "What's going on, son?" Beto looked at him. He was 34 years old and had been Rodrigo's bodyguard for 8 years, and he had learned to read situations before they turned into problems. What he saw now in that gray van, and in the two men who didn't get out, had a form he recognized. "Look after the girl in the blue uniform," he said. "Don't lose sight of her, Lucia." Lucia knew nothing about the gray van. She was in the kitchen preparing lunch for noon. Rodrigo had asked for the meal with Isabella to be at home, with home-cooked food, without external waiters or elements that might seem too formal or too prepared. Feigned normalcy was part of Fernanda's plan. Lucia was preparing beef broth with vegetables because it was the dish she knew best how to make, and because on tense mornings the kitchen was the only place where her body knew exactly what to do, without her head having to direct it. It was Don Aurelio who entered the kitchen at 11:15, under the pretext of asking for a glass of water. "How are you, Lucia?" he asked in his usual calm voice, a little hoarse from the years and the tobacco he had quit a decade ago, but which had still left a particular texture in his vocal cords. "Fine, Don Aurelio. Do you want water, or would you prefer I make you coffee?" "Water is fine." He sat on the stool by the island, where he always sat when he passed through the kitchen. He accepted the glass, drank slowly. "Are you going out today?" "I hadn't planned to." "Why?" "For nothing." He looked at the broth. "That smells good." Lucia knew him well enough to know that Don Aurelio never asked things for nothing, but she also knew him well enough to know that if he didn't want to tell her something directly, he had his reasons, and pressing him was useless. "Is everything okay outside?" she asked carefully. Don Aurelio took another sip of water. "The garden is very beautiful today," he said. "The jacarandas are in their prime. It's a shame you can't go out for a walk on the street to enjoy them." It was a warning. Lucia held his gaze for a second. "Understood," she said in a low voice. Don Aurelio stood up, left the glass by the sink, and left the kitchen with his usual calm pace. At 11:40, Beto went up to Lucia's room. He had gone to look for her because she was no longer in the kitchen, and he explained the situation in direct, unadorned terms, which was the only way Beto knew how to communicate. "There are two men outside. They're not from the neighborhood. They've been there for hours. It's possible they're nothing, but given the circumstances..." He looked towards the closed door of the room, as if he could see through it to the street. "I'd prefer you stay in the interior wing of the house until Isabella arrives and leaves." "Do you think they're coming for me?" "I don't know, but if Isabella found out you're the main witness and that you have Elena's phone, how would she find out?" Beto was silent for a moment. "Elena is in the guest room," he finally said, "under guard. But guard doesn't mean completely incommunicado." Lucia processed that. "Can I speak with Don Rodrigo? He's with Fernanda preparing the meeting. I don't want to interrupt him unless it's necessary. And if it is necessary, if those men move before Isabella arrives, I'll tell you, and we'll go talk to him." Beto looked at her with the direct seriousness that was his way of conveying that the situation was real but controllable. "For now, stay here. Don't look out the windows that face the street." Lucia nodded. Beto left. She remained seated on the edge of the bed, looking at the small window of her room that faced the interior garden, not the street. And she thought there was something profoundly ironic about the woman who had spent 3 years becoming invisible to survive inside a large house, now needing to become invisible to survive in a much more literal sense. Isabella arrived at exactly 12 o'clock. She entered the mansion with her usual elegance, in a cream dress and pearl earrings, and the calibrated smile of a woman who has everything under control. She greeted Rodrigo with a kiss on the cheek. She asked about Mateo with the studied warmth of someone who practices warmth in front of a mirror. She sat down in the main dining room and accepted the glass of mineral water that no one had offered her yet, but which she took from the tray Lucia was carrying from the kitchen, with the naturalness of someone who assumes the objects of the world are there for her. She didn't look at Lucia once. That alone said everything, because Isabella always looked at the employees. It was part of her method to ignore them in public, observe them in private, constantly evaluate who knew what, and how dangerous that knowledge was. That she didn't look at Lucia today meant the exact opposite of what it seemed. It meant she was looking at her the entire time with the part of her mind that had learned to operate in parallel to her visible face. Lucia left the tray and withdrew to the kitchen. From there, through the half-open door, she heard the beginning of the conversation. Rodrigo started calmly. He spoke of Friday's incident as if he were still processing it, with the slightly agitated voice of a man who hasn't slept well and is looking for answers. He mentioned the cake. He mentioned that he had called someone he trusted to analyze it. He mentioned that the results had been concerning. Isabella responded with exactly the right amount of alarm and solidarity. Rodrigo mentioned that the police might be involved soon. Isabella responded that it was the right thing to do and that he could count on her full support. Rodrigo said he was concerned about the will, that he had found a clause he didn't remember approving. And that's where Isabella made the first mistake. That clause, we discussed it, you and I, she said with a security that was barely too quick. In February, don't you remember? You were very tired that week. I think you had a lot of work. Silence from the other side. In February, Rodrigo said. Yes, it was one afternoon here in the library. You told me you wanted to protect Mateo in case something happened to you, and I suggested the trust. Calculated pause. Do you really not remember? It worries me, Rodrigo. Stress can affect memory. Another silence. From the kitchen, Lucia held her breath. Isabella had just confirmed with her own words that she was present at that meeting in February. The meeting Rodrigo didn't remember because he was under the effects of scopolamine. The meeting that, according to Elena's statement, had been orchestrated for that very purpose. Everything was being recorded on the device Fernanda had installed under the dining room table that morning. It was at that moment that Beto's phone vibrated. Lucia heard it from the kitchen because Beto was right on the other side of the door. She heard his low voice saying, "How many?" And then, understood, and then the sound of his rapid footsteps toward the hallway. She left the kitchen. What happened? The men in the van got out, Beto said in a very low voice. They're trying to get in through the side garden door. Don Aurelio is delaying them. He looked at her directly. I need you to go with Mateo to the safe room. Now, the safe room behind the library. Rodrigo knows where it is. You go. You tell him in a low voice, without interrupting the meeting, and you take him there. Lucia didn't argue. She crossed the hallway towards the dining room, opened the door just enough to peek in, and saw Rodrigo looking at her from the head of the table with an expression that changed as soon as he read hers. Excuse me, Lucia said, in the most neutral tone she could. Don Rodrigo, Mateo is asking for you. It wasn't true, but it was an exit. Rodrigo apologized to Isabella, who remained seated with her glass of mineral water and her porcelain smile, and went out into the hallway. Lucia explained in 10 seconds what Beto had told her. Rodrigo didn't change his expression. It was the calm of men who have handled crises for 20 years and have learned that visible panic never solves anything. Where is Beto now? In the side garden. Don Aurelio with him, and Fernanda in the boardroom, I think. Rodrigo nodded. You go with Mateo to the safe room. I'll take care of the rest. And the meeting with Isabella, we already have what we needed. He said it with a calmness that was almost more alarming than the danger itself. Fernanda is listening in real time from the boardroom. Isabella has already incriminated herself. Lucia looked at him for a second. And you? I'm fine, Lucia. She hadn't asked if he was fine. She had asked if he was safe. Rodrigo looked at her with an expression that, for an instant, was completely different from anything she had ever seen from him before. Not the millionaire, not the boss, not the man at the anniversary dinner who laughed while everyone else laughed. He was just a man who had finally realized someone cared about him in a way that wasn't about obligation or protocol. Yes, he said, I'm sure. And he went back into the dining room. The two men from the gray van never made it inside. Don Aurelio intercepted them at the side door with a calm that belied his age and bad knee. He told them the property was private, that cameras were recording them, and that security was on its way with backup. He said it without raising his voice, without threats, with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 19 years as the last line of defense for that garden and had no intention of moving. The men looked at each other. They left. Beto arrived 40 seconds later and found Don Aurelio standing by the side door, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who had just won a chess match, without moving more than 2 pieces. Did they leave? Beto asked. They left, Don Aurelio said. How did you convince them? The old man looked at him with something that was almost a smile. I told them the truth, he replied. Some things just work that way. At 2 p.m., Isabella emerged from the mansion in her cream dress and pearl earrings, exactly as she had entered. She kissed Rodrigo on the cheek. She said she hoped everything would be resolved soon. She got into her car. 10 minutes later, Fernanda entered the dining room with her tablet and played the fragment of the recording where Isabella confirmed her presence at the February meeting. Everyone heard it. Rodrigo, Lucia, Mateo, Beto, and Don Aurelio, who had been invited to sit for the first time in 19 years in the mansion's main dining room, and did so with the same quiet dignity with which he did everything. When the recording ended, Fernanda turned off the tablet. Tomorrow morning, we present everything to the public ministry, she said. With this, plus the toxicology analysis, plus Elena's statement, plus the call records, she paused. Isabella isn't getting out of this. The dining room fell silent. Don Aurelio looked at his coffee cup. Lucia had brought him one without being asked, and he had accepted it with a nod that was worth more than a speech. And he said, "Almost always, big lies make a lot of noise when they fall." No one contradicted him. Monday dawned with low clouds over Guadalajara, the kind of soft gray that couldn't quite decide between rain and calm, making the city seem lost in deep thought. Fernanda Solis arrived at the mansion at 7 a.m. with 2 assistants, a 3-centimeter thick folder, and the expression of someone who hadn't slept well in days but was forbidden to show it. She ate breakfast standing in the kitchen, the coffee Lucia made her without anyone asking, and at 8 sharp, she was ready to present the complete evidence package to the public ministry. Rodrigo dressed in the same navy blue suit he wore for important meetings. Not the formal one, not the one for appearances, but the one for work, the one that meant he was about to do something that mattered. Before leaving, he went down to the kitchen. Lucia was preparing Mateo's breakfast, huevos rancheros with beans and freshly made tortillas, the boy's favorite since he was 8, which she had learned to make exactly how he liked it, without anyone explaining, just by watching. "Things will be in the papers today," Rodrigo said from the doorway. "Probably before noon. Isabella's name will be there, and yours too, Lucia, as a witness." She kept flipping the eggs. "I know. Are you okay with that?" "I don't have the option not to be. And even if she did," she carefully placed the plate on the tray. "Yes, I'm okay with it." Rodrigo nodded. "Fernanda will need your formal statement this afternoon when we get back. Can you be available?" "Yes, sir." A pause. "Lucia." His voice changed subtly. It lost some of its operational tone and acquired something harder to classify. "After today, things in this house will be different. I want you to know that." She looked at him for the first time since he had entered the kitchen. "Different? How?" "I don't know exactly yet, but different." And he left. The presentation to the public ministry took 4 hours. Fernanda presented the evidence in the order she had designed. First, the toxicological analysis, with the report signed by the external laboratory, proving the presence of digitalis and scopolamine in both the cake and the coffee sample recovered by Lucia. Then the communication records between Elena and Isabella's number. Then, Elena Paredes's formal statement, recorded the previous day in the presence of a defense attorney and a notary, in which she described, point by point, her participation in the plan, her access to the restaurant's cameras, the modification of the cake order, the doses of scopolamine in Rodrigo's coffee for 4 months, and the February meeting where Isabella had taken advantage of Rodrigo's altered state to have him sign the will clause. And finally, the dining room recording, the fragment where Isabella, with her calm voice and pearl earrings, confirmed her presence at that February meeting. She confirmed, without knowing it, everything Elena had already declared. The public ministry agent listened to the recording twice, then looked at Fernanda. "When do you want us to proceed?" "Today," Fernanda said. Before she could move, Isabella was arrested at 1:47 p.m., not at her home but at the Alcázar restaurant in Colonia Americana, where she had been meeting 2 friends. The friends were left petrified, their glasses of white wine halfway between the table and their lips, when the 2 plainclothes agents approached the table and asked Isabella to accompany them. She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene. She stood up with the same composure with which she had entered the restaurant, picked up her purse, and said to her friends in a voice that didn't tremble, "Call my lawyer." It was the last thing she said, as a free woman for a long time. The news reached the mansion at 2:15 p.m., via a message from Fernanda to Rodrigo. Rodrigo was in the library when he received it. He read the message, read it again, placed the phone on the desk, and stared at the wall for a moment that Lucia, who had entered to pick up an empty cup, didn't interrupt. When he spoke, he did so without turning around. "They have her." "Yes, sir." "How do you feel?" It was a question no one asked her. No one had asked her in a long time. "Relieved," she said honestly, and still a little scared. Both things at the same time. Rodrigo nodded, still looking at the wall. "Me too." Lucia picked up the cup and headed for the door. "Lucia, sir." He turned. He looked at her with that expression that had appeared several times in recent days, and that she still didn't quite know how to read. Direct, serious, without the usual distance that 12 years of domestic hierarchy had built between them. Sit down for a moment. She sat down. Fernanda gave me a preliminary report this morning, Rodrigo said, about your mother's land. Lucia remained very still. The company that bought it after her death was called Desarrollos Occidente del Pacífico. It was a shell company. Behind it was a name, Ernesto Villanueva. He paused. My brother. The silence that followed was the kind that is felt physically. Your mother's land was in an area that 3 years later was declared an industrial development zone. Today, it's worth 120 times what was paid for it. Rodrigo watched her without looking away. Ernesto bought it through the shell company, paying a fraction of its real value, taking advantage of the fact that you were a minor and that the legal guardian assigned to you was a lawyer who worked for him. Lucia said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because there was too much, and it all arrived at once, and she didn't know where to start to sort it out. And my mother, she finally said, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. Isabella. We don't know for sure yet, but Isabella had access to Ernesto's movements. She knew about the land purchase, and if your mother discovered something, or represented a risk to the transaction. He didn't finish the sentence. It wasn't necessary. Lucia looked at her hands on her lap. The same hands that for 3 years had been cleaning, cooking, pouring poisoned coffee down the drain. The same hands that on Friday had pointed to a cake in a luxury restaurant in front of 200 people who had laughed at her. She felt something moving in her chest. It wasn't exactly crying, it was something older and deeper. The sensation that a door that had been closed for 8 years had just been flung open, and on the other side there was not darkness but light. Too much light at once, and her eyes needed time to adjust. What happens with that now? Fernanda asked. It will be included in the investigation. If the connection is confirmed, Isabella faces additional charges, and the land, Rodrigo paused. The land was acquired fraudulently. With the right lawyers, there's a real possibility of recovering it, or receiving compensation equivalent to its current value. Lucia looked at him. Why are you doing this for me? Because it's the right thing to do. There are many right things that people don't do. Rodrigo nodded. Yes, and then, with a simplicity that didn't try to be more than it was. And why do I owe you? That afternoon, Mateo arrived from school and found Lucia sitting on the garden terrace, her gaze fixed on the jacaranda in the background, with an expression that he, with his 15 years and the intuition, inherited from a mother who was no longer there, knew meant someone was processing something very big. He sat beside her without asking anything. They were silent for a while. Then Mateo said, Do you know what my mom told me before she died? Well, not exactly before, a few months before, when she was still well. She told me that people who do good things without anyone seeing them are the ones who truly hold the world together. He paused. I think she was talking about people like you. Lucia looked at him. He was 15 years old, with his father's eyes, and the wisdom of someone who had lost the person they loved most too soon, and who therefore knew that time is finite, and important words should not be kept. Your mother was very intelligent, Lucia said. Yes, Mateo replied, and I think she would have really liked you. The scandal erupted Tuesday morning, not in one newspaper, as Rodrigo had anticipated, but in 2, then 3, then all of them at once, like when a small dam gives way and the water doesn't wait its turn. The headlines varied in detail but agreed on the essentials. Sister-in-law of Tapatio businessman, arrested for alleged attempted murder and testamentary fraud. Domestic employee, allegedly uncovered the plan. Rodrigo's phone didn't stop ringing from 7 a.m. He didn't answer any calls, not on his approved list. Fernanda managed communication with the press from the group's office with a brief, precise, unadorned statement. The Villanueva family confirmed that an investigation was underway, that they would fully cooperate with the authorities, and that there would be no further statements until the legal process had greater definition. What the statement didn't mention, because it wasn't the press's business, was that same morning, Rodrigo had summoned his personal lawyer to begin the process of nullifying the testamentary clause signed under the influence of scopolamine, and that he had signed a new will, this time without pressure, without substances, and with 3 independent witnesses, in which 100% of the estate was protected in a trust for Mateo until he reached adulthood, with an additional allocation for the Children of the Future Foundation of Jalisco, which Rodrigo had been discreetly supporting for 2 years. Lucia's name wasn't in that will. She didn't know it would appear in a different document, signed the very same day, which Rodrigo kept in the central drawer of the mahogany desk, a document not yet meant to be revealed. Lucia's formal statement to the public ministry lasted 3 hours. The officer taking it was a middle-aged man with glasses and a way of asking questions that was methodical without being unpleasant. He'd ask, listen, write, then ask again to confirm. Lucia answered everything with the same direct clarity she'd learned to employ when the situation demanded it. No drama, no embellishment, just the precision of someone who remembers well, because they've trained their memory to survive. Fernanda was present for the entire statement. She spoke only when necessary, but her presence was a silent form of protection that Lucia appreciated without having to say it. When they left, it was well past noon. On the street, in front of the public ministry building, 2 photographers were waiting. One of them, recognizing Fernanda, raised his camera. Lucia instinctively turned her back. "You don't have to hide," Fernanda said beside her. "I don't want to be photographed." "I understand. But being photographed doesn't make you any less of who you are." Lucia thought about that as they walked to the car. It was a phrase that seemed simple, yet felt much more complicated inside. Like those boxes that don't look like they hold much from the outside, but have more space within than you'd imagine. The trouble arrived at 4 p.m. Rodrigo called her to the service wing room with a voice that was unnaturally neutral, the kind of neutrality deliberately constructed to hide what lay beneath. "I need to speak with you." She went down. She entered the library and sat in her usual armchair. Rodrigo was behind the desk, holding an envelope. He placed it on the mahogany surface with a gesture that wasn't accusatory, but by no means light. "This arrived today from Isabella's lawyer." Lucia looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A sworn statement from a man named Aurelio Torres, who claims to be a neighbor from Tlacolula and says he's known you since you were a child." Rodrigo opened the envelope and took out 3 pages. "According to this statement, you and your mother had a known conflict in the village with the family of a local land buyer, and when that buyer died, you left town abruptly and never returned. The statement suggested," he paused, choosing his words, "that you might have your own motives for fabricating evidence against Isabella, and that your presence in this house might not have been accidental." The silence that followed was the kind you could hear. Lucia let it exist for a full 5 seconds. Then she said, "Do you believe me?" Rodrigo looked at her directly. "Yes. Why? Because you've been in this house for 3 years, and in 3 years I've never seen you lie about anything. Not about the big things, not about the small things. And because the evidence you presented, Elena's cell phone, the months of spilled coffee, that's not the kind of thing you fabricate, it's the kind of thing you live." Lucia nodded slowly. "Aurelio Torres is not my neighbor," she said. "There was never any land conflict with any family. My mother was a woman who had a garden and 2 chickens and who never bothered anyone in her life." She looked at the envelope. "Isabella is desperate. When desperate people can't destroy the evidence, they try to destroy the witness. I know." Rodrigo put the pages back in the envelope. "Fernanda is already responding. This statement won't get far, but it will reach the newspapers." A pause. "It's probably already on its way." Lucia nodded, looked at her hands, and breathed. "Do you know what the strangest thing is?" she said after a moment. "For 3 years, I did everything I could to be invisible, to not draw attention, to be exactly what a housekeeper is supposed to be in a big house. And it turns out the only thing that had to happen for all that to stop working was for someone to try to kill the wrong person." Rodrigo listened without interrupting. "And now my name is going to be in all the newspapers. People will have opinions about me without knowing me. Some will say I'm brave, and others will say I'm opportunistic, and others will invent things that didn't happen." Another pause. "And I can't control any of it." "No," Rodrigo admitted. "You can't." "How does one live with that?" It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, asked by someone who truly didn't know. And she was asking someone who perhaps did. Rodrigo thought before answering, deciding which voice mattered. "Not all voices carry the same weight," he finally said. "The people who know you, who were there, who saw what happened, those voices matter. The others are noise. It takes time to learn to distinguish them. But you do learn." Lucia looked at him. "Did you learn?" "I'm still learning." What the newspapers published the next day was indeed a profile of Lucia that mixed admiration and speculation in varying proportions. Some focused on the human interest story, the young woman from Tlacolula, the dead mother, the years of silent work, the moment in the restaurant. Others latched onto Aurelio Torres's statement, which was, as Lucia had said, entirely fabricated, and presented it as an alternative version that cast doubt. Mateo read it all on his phone during breakfast, and then set it face down on the table with an expression of genuine disgust. "People write garbage," Mateo said. Rodrigo added, "It's true." "Yes," his father admitted, "but usually it doesn't help to say it out loud." "Usually," repeated Mateo, who had inherited his father's precision with words when it suited him. "But sometimes it does." Lucia, who was bringing the orange juice, overheard this from the doorway and had to make a real effort not to smile. It was 3 days later, a Thursday afternoon, when Fernanda arrived at the mansion with news no one had entirely expected, though everyone, deep down, had sensed it might come. The supplementary analyses requested from the forensic laboratory regarding Guadalupe Mendoza's death 18 years ago had found records compatible with poisoning by cardiac glycosides. The doctors at the regional hospital had classified the case as natural heart failure because, at the time, there was no protocol for detecting that type of substance in a hospital of that kind. But the preserved documentation, cross-referenced with the patterns identified in Rodrigo's current case, allowed for the reopening of the file. Fernanda presented the information with her usual professionalism. Then she waited. Lucia was sitting in the corner armchair in the library, as always, her hands in her lap. She didn't cry, she didn't shout, she didn't say anything for a long minute that no one tried to fill. Then she said, very slowly, in a voice that was completely serene, in a way that was harder to sustain than any cry, "So I wasn't wrong about anything from the beginning." "No," Fernanda said. "You weren't wrong." Rodrigo, from behind the desk, watched her. Mateo, who had entered the library under the pretense of looking for a book, and had stayed without anyone noticing, stood by the bookshelf with his book closed in his hand, and his eyes bright. Don Aurelio, who had come to the library that day because Rodrigo had specifically invited him to be present, because Rodrigo had begun to understand that some people had always been there and deserved to be present in the moments that mattered. He looked at Lucia with the deep calm of someone who has lived long enough to know that justice sometimes arrives late, but when it arrives whole. "What happens now with that?" Lucia asked. "The investigation into your mother is incorporated into Isabella's case," Fernanda said. "The charges are expanded. It's no longer just the attempt on Rodrigo's life." She paused. "This changes the entire weight of the sentence." Lucia nodded. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that moment, in the library of a mansion that was not hers, surrounded by people who, 3 days earlier, had barely known her by sight, Lucia Mendoza did something she hadn't done since she was 17. Since the hospital hallway where her mother was fading without anyone knowing why. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had carried for 8 years, not to sink under it, but simply to acknowledge it, to say, "I saw you, you exist, and now I can let you go." No one in the room spoke, but Rodrigo, from behind the desk, extended his hand over the mahogany surface, palm up, in a gesture that demanded nothing, but offered something. And Lucia, after a moment, placed her hand over his. And so they remained in silence as outside the Guadalajara sky began to fill with the first dark clouds of the rainy season, and the jacaranda in the garden swayed gently in the wind that arrived from the west, laden with moisture and promises, justice and a new dawn. 3 weeks later, Lucia packed her suitcase. Not the small one she had arrived in Guadalajara with 8 years ago. That one no longer existed. She had replaced it with a sturdy fabric one she bought at the San Juan de Dios market in her first year at the mansion. This was a larger one, navy blue, which she filled with the same silent discipline with which she did everything, folding carefully, maximizing space, leaving nothing important behind. She didn't tell anyone, or at least, she thought she didn't. Isabella Fuentes de Villanueva faced charges of attempted aggravated homicide, testamentary fraud, administration of substances for cognitive alteration, and once Guadalupe Mendoza's file was formally incorporated into the investigation, an additional charge of intentional homicide with aggravating circumstances. Her lawyer had attempted 3 different defenses in 3 weeks, and all 3 had collapsed under the volume and consistency of the evidence. Elena Paredes was under house arrest awaiting trial, having reached a cooperation agreement that would reduce her sentence in exchange for her full testimony. Aurelio Torres's false statement was discredited in 4 days. The man who had signed it, a real man, unlike the invented neighbor, admitted that an intermediary had paid him 3,000 pesos to do so. The intermediary led to Isabella. The fraudulent will was annulled, and the land in Tlacolula, or more precisely, financial compensation equivalent to its current market value, calculated by 3 independent appraisers, was in the process of being legally transferred to the name of Lucia Rebecca Mendoza Reyes, sole daughter of Guadalupe Mendoza, born on March 14th, in a small town where dreams dried in the sun before ripening, until one finally did. The morning Lucia packed her suitcase, Rodrigo was in a meeting downtown. Mateo was at school, Fernanda in her office. Don Aurelio was completing his night shift and sleeping in his guardhouse room. Only Beto saw her leave with the navy blue suitcase on her shoulder, crossing the garden towards the side exit with her usual calm pace. He let her reach the gate. Then he took out his phone and dialed a number. "She's leaving now," he said simply. The Guadalajara bus station at 11 a.m. was a world in constant motion. Families with bundles, students with backpacks, ladies with baskets that smelled of homemade food wrapped in wax paper. Voices in every tone and every urgency. Lucia bought her ticket at the window for the line heading north, towards Tlacolula, towards the place she had left with a folded letter and a broken heart, and which she now wanted to see again. Not to stay, but to close. To tell the earth where her mother was buried, that the truth had finally arrived, that it hadn't been an undetermined cause, that there was a name and a reason and a justice in process. She tucked the ticket into the pocket of her jacket, sat on one of the orange plastic benches in the waiting area, placed the blue suitcase between her feet, and waited. Rodrigo arrived 17 minutes later. He wasn't alone. He was with Mateo, who should have been in school but had clearly convinced someone that this was more urgent than 3 hours of classes. And he was with Don Aurelio, who had shown up without being asked, and when questioned, had claimed he had an errand in the area anyway, a transparent lie. But no one contradicted him. Rodrigo found Lucia on the orange bench, the suitcase nestled between her feet. He sat beside her. Mateo and Don Aurelio stood a respectful distance away, feigning an interest in the departure board that was utterly unconvincing. "Where are you going?" Rodrigo asked. "To Tlacolula." "For how long?" Lucia considered her answer. "I don't know. I need to go. I need to spend some time there, see the place my mother grew up, see what's left." She paused. "Close something that's been open for a very long time." Rodrigo nodded. "I understand." Silence. "I thought you were leaving for good," he finally said. "Why would you think that?" "Because you packed your bag without telling anyone." Lucia looked at him. "I'm a domestic worker, sir. I don't have to ask permission to leave." "You're not a domestic worker anymore, Lucia." The words were spoken with such simplicity, such an absence of drama or an attempt to impress, that it was precisely their plainness that made them land. "What am I then?" she asked, her voice a genuine blend of curiosity and a touch of apprehension about the answer. Rodrigo glanced at the departure board, where Mateo and Don Aurelio were still unconvincingly pretending not to listen. "Someone I want to come back," he said. "Not to clean rooms, not to spill poisoned coffee, just to be here if you want to be." The bus station remained noisy and hurried around them, utterly indifferent to what was unfolding on that orange bench, which is exactly how it should be when something real happens between two people. No background music, no special lighting, no applause, just life with all its ordinary noise, and in the middle of it, two people fumbling honestly toward seeing each other. Lucia looked at her ticket, then back at Rodrigo. "I'm going for 2 weeks," she said. 3, at most. Something in Rodrigo's face shifted, subtly but visibly. "That's fine. And when I get back," she continued, with the direct clarity that had always been her way of navigating the world, "we're going to have a very serious conversation about what it means to be in this house. In plain words, with no assumptions from either side. Okay? Promise me?" "I promise." Mateo approached then, his 15-year-old patience wearing thin. "Are you leaving?" he asked Lucia. 2 weeks. 3 at most. And then you come back?" "Yes." The boy nodded with a solemnity that was both comical and utterly sincere. "Good, because no one else makes huevos rancheros like you." Lucia let out a real, brief laugh, the first completely unburdened one in many days. Don Aurelio, from his post by the departure board, smiled without turning. He knew because that was Don Aurelio. He knew everything without having to see it. The bus departed at 11:45. Lucia settled by the window, the blue suitcase in the overhead compartment, her jacket folded over her knees. The landscape of Guadalajara gradually gave way to hills and open fields, and the sky, which in that direction always seemed to have more room to breathe. She thought of her mother, of the small orchard and the two chickens, of the folded letter, of the floral scent with a bitter undertone she never forgot, which had turned out to be the most important clue of her life. She thought of an orange bench in a bus station, and a man who had said, "Someone I want to come back," with the simplicity of someone speaking a truth for the first time in a long time. She thought of Mateo and his huevos rancheros, of Don Aurelio and his invented errands, of Fernanda and the door she'd asked her not to close. She thought that the world, which sometimes seemed built solely to crush those without a surname, without money, without anyone to defend them, did, however, have these small cracks through which light filtered, a memory that recalls a scent, a spilled coffee in silence, a hand extended over a mahogany desk, cracks that sometimes, if one is stubborn enough to keep walking, become doors. The bus picked up speed on the open highway. Lucia rested her forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed her eyes. For the first time in 8 years, she carried nothing that wasn't hers, and she discovered that was exactly enough. The end.